IAPPA, the great coaster showcase where all the big manufacturers come to play and display all of their new innovations, ideas, and upcoming projects on their timeline. Every year there are new ideas being pushed by manufacturers, but do all of them really catch on? I started thinking about this after the past few years when some of the new designs which are being showcased. As of late, we have the Wild Moose by RMC, or their T-Rex and Split Rex, ground up Titan track, and most of what SNS and Perla have been unveiling lately just aren't being built. Of course, for some of these models, it's way too soon to tell if they're never going to be built. Personally, I really hope to see an SNS Axis get built soon. I mean, wasn't there supposed to be one at Qiddiya? I wonder whatever happened to that, but that's not really the point here. The point is that there have been several prototypes which have made it past the drawing room floor, even get promoted at events like IAPPA, but they were never built. All of these come from many years ago, so I think it's safe to say that they're never going to be constructed, at least not in the way that they were initially presented, especially because some of these are from defunct manufacturers. I found it rather interesting because you never really know if the designs you're looking at are something that you'll actually get to ride, and if you don't ever get to ride them, you won't really realize that for many, many years. The cantilever roller coaster is an interesting concept because it is one that kind of actually does exist today with the Donkey Kong roller coasters at the Universal parks. The major differences stem from the axis of movement which were proposed in the ideas. Now, there were patents filed for this design way back in 1999, which were not improved until August of 2001. Now, these expired in July of 2019, which I believe is probably what allowed Universal to create their own rendition. The ride vehicle was meant to traverse along a set of vertical rails which allowed the car to shift on multiple axes, where the Donkey Kong roller coaster kind of only has one axis that it traverses. This design was something that was created independently, yet would be built through Setpoint, although, as we all know, it was never truly built. In fact, most people were likely never even aware of its existence because it never had a ton of traction behind it. This is generally the issue with some of these concepts, is that there's really a lack of information to be found online about these designs, especially things that were from around the turn of the century, where not everything was fully integrated into the World Wide Web yet, limiting the dispersion of knowledge, especially in certain niches. This one is particularly interesting as the concepts and patents for the design were independently pushed, hoping that a manufacturer in a park would pick them up and run with it. This, sadly, would never happen. Well, at least kind of. Setpoint is actually the manufacturer of the Minecart Madness rides, so it seems as though they may have gotten some heavy inspiration from the original 20 years ago. The optimism for new innovations in the industry was at an all-time high during the turn of the century, and the coaster wars which occurred during that period. This will be a rather short segment as there is the least amount of information on this design by far. The design was much before the web was invented, and there's very little evidence of this, yet I decided it was something that would be worth sharing. Technically, there is no manufacturer tied to the image, but it seems very clear that it would be made by Schwarzkopf, as the rest of the layout strongly resembles their flat, portable designs. It looks a bit more advanced than anything which was produced, having steeper drops, more unique inversions, while still showcasing multiple brake runs throughout the ride and a curved lift hill, which we all know is like basically what Schwarzkopf did back in the day. The star of the show is the insane figure eight loop, which you may be familiar of if you've played Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. I believe this was an inversion that was added to the hyper coaster in that game. There was a surprising number of defunct ideas which made their way into different roller coaster games. This inversion does not seem like it had any chance of being properly supported based on the image, but man, would I have loved to see it in real life. If I had to guess, this is probably one of the most intense inversions ever created, which probably would also be way too intense for the ride. The Vekoma dive pretzel is a very unique case, as not only is it the newest model in this video, but it also had a real sale. At least a portion of this ride was fabricated and constructed in China, yet the project was never completed before the ride sat dormant for a few years and ended up getting demolished. The dive pretzel appears to be some sort of crossover between a Eurofighter, a Mauer X-Car, and maybe even a little bit of the Intamin Space Diver. The Great Mall of China began construction in 2006 before running into several issues which delayed its construction. Eventually, the indoor amusement park was added to the plans, boasting two different Vekomas. In 2013, parts of the roller coaster and trains began arriving and getting constructed, although there's no public information about what the layout of this ride may be. However, I found a speculative animation that I was able to dig up. The most interesting part of this is looking at the trains, as they appear to have a different form of restraints, which is possibly the first showcase of their restraints which have showed up on their new generation rides. The entire ride looks quite different from anything Vekoma has ever constructed, as it has a completely unique track profiling for them. Now, by the end of 2016, progress on the ride was reversed, deconstruction began, and it seemed as though fabrication of the track was never completed. The entire mall project was abandoned due to funding and never opened in any capacity. Even if this had opened, more than likely no one would have really heard much about it anyways, as it would have been a small Chinese park, but it's still sad to see the project fall apart this way. There was a rumor about this model being proposed to one of the parks slated for a lander that never planned out, although I could probably make an entire video about extravagant failures of park proposals in Florida over the last few decades. The Stengel Tower Coaster is another example of a patented design which made its way into Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. In this game, it was known as the Rotating Tower Coaster. This concept was designed by Warner Stengel, which is somewhat of a big name in the industry, as he has gotten his name into a lot of different rides, even if he's not a very talked about individual as of late. The patents were filed in late 2001 and were approved in June of 2004. Reading through the patented paperwork, there are even two layouts which were attached to the documents which detailed some of the primary components of the design. The entire idea of the design was to be able to have a vertical rotating post act as a transfer track during the ride. A car would ride up the vertical spike, be pulled up like a kind of a boomerang chain lift, it seems, before the entire tower would rotate 90 degrees to a new track and release the train. The train would travel back down the tower in the reverse direction through some amount of layout before returning to the same tower and spinning back to the original direction. As the tower rotating 90 degrees would need four tracks to constantly have attachment ready, Stengel planned to use all four sides as connections to the rest of the layout. This looks like it had the potential to be a very dynamic ride, which would bear some resemblance to the family coasters which have begun popping up, where they kind of travel one direction, spin, and then travel back. But perhaps this design was just too far ahead of its time to ever succeed. The technology demonstrated here would allow for some extremely unique layouts and elements. It's quite a shame that this was never a real ride, although it does look to be a technical nightmare, so there's not really too much of a wonder as why it didn't, especially for the early 2000s. Now you may be thinking, Giovanola? Really? Yep, you better believe it. Back in their day, they actually had some real innovation outside of a single inverted coaster and two somewhat lackluster hypercoasters. However, nothing ended up working out for them the way that they would have wished. This was something that got showcased in IAPPA in 2000, 2 years before Gravity Max opened. Not only was it before Gravity Max, but it was also quite a bit cooler in my opinion. While an initial simulation and patent paper which showcased a design with the backdrop of Magic Mountain actually had a more simple truss tilt track similar to Vekoma, their model was much more interesting. An old video from their showcase, which can be found, showcases a small functional prototype. The main difference is that there's a whole lot more degrees of freedom with this tilt track. It appears that there are three rotational degrees of freedom. Not only is it able to tilt along the train's axis, but it's also able to swivel like a turntable and roll side to side, kind of like the banking of a turn. This system would probably be overly difficult to construct, however, and that would never end up being constructed. Giovanola would only end up building Titan before becoming a defunct manufacturer. It's very interesting to note that Vekoma did release their tilt model at this time and only sold one. Ultimately, there did not seem to be a market yet for this type of ride, and perhaps Giovanola's design was too far from reality to be sold at this time. Pipeline may be the most well-known failed prototype in this video, although I've not heard a ton of discourse on it. This is another model which slipped its way into Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, as is the next one actually. Their track record with these could practically be considered a curse. If your prototype is in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, chances are you're not getting any sales. This may more be related to the ease of programming the system into a game rather than actual engineering the components and getting a sale on it, but it's just something funny to think about. There's easily the most information about this prototype compared to any others, despite it originating around the late 80s into the early 90s. As was meant to be Arrow's next major ride type, following their loopers and suspended coasters in the prior decades. A lot of hours and labor went into this prototype, and eventually money as well. This made it beyond the computer screen and models and actually had a model get built in the Aero facility. This technically means it was built, however, because there were no permanent installations, it I don't really count it. That being said, this generated a lot of attention when it was built and even had real riders on a couple of occasions. The ride fully sinks into the track, attempting to recreate some maneuvers which a fighter pilot could make. The angles which this created were extremely unique, and I really wish I would have been alive and lucky enough to try out something like this. The ride was clearly meant to focus on inversions, which may have been part of its downfall. When you really look at it, there isn't a ton that this can do which a standard looper could not. The primary benefit would be tighter turns and smaller cars as compared to the very large drawn out trains which their loopers ran with. Sadly, Arrow struggled to get this ride to conform with ride regulations and eventually abandoned the project, which they hoped to debut in 1992, never having it leave the prototyping phase. However, if the Ultra Twister exists, which it does, I feel like this ride surely could have as well, yet it was just never meant to be, I guess. So here we have Setpoint back at it again with another banger prototype. This brings one of the more creative innovations on the list, adding a mechanism which has never been done before. As previously mentioned, you can play around and build this model in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. It seems as though Setpoint was fixed on a side mount ride vehicle at this point in time, attempting to have two tracks combined together to make one square truss, which the ride vehicles would travel along. The idea was for this ride to operate as a single ride vehicle through a portion of the ride before the track would split and enter a dueling section of the coaster. I just absolutely adore this idea. The spectacle of a track splitting during a ride, allowing for a portion of the ride to be dueling, is just so sick. And it was not just meant to be a family coaster. The patented paperwork for the design shows a number of different inversions and elements which the track type would allow for you. And let me tell you, these ideas are absolute gas. It's maybe one of my favorites of all the designs. I want something like this to be real so badly. The capabilities of this ride seem like they're through the roof compared to a lot of other ideas. There's just so many things which this ride can do which other rides are not capable of. Now, do I have even a semblance of a clue of how the ride vehicles would work to remain close and clasped together and unclasped? Nope, but I'm sure they did at least. And if they didn't, well, that's probably why the idea got scrapped. But please, someone make this happen. The design was in the works in the early 2000s, and the patent has expired in the middle of 2018. So that does leave the door open for another company to investigate these designs and come in with their own rendition in the future. And boy, do I hope someone does. Narrowly missing out on being the newest model in the video is the Backtrack design by Great Coasters International. Backtrack is such a well-polished model that it could totally be sold today, and I would not be surprised, although it's not promoted by them anymore. This model was published on their website in the News tab during day one of the 2012 IAPPA Expo, but it did not get a dedicated section for the new model. Using the Internet Archive, I found the news archive sat on their page until June of 2020, when it and all of their old news stories were removed as they overhauled the entire design of the website at that time. I find it rather interesting that there was no promotion of design further outside of IAPPA in 2012, unless they ran into some sort of design complications. It was a bit ahead of its time, as family boomerangs have a huge market right now, but we could use some spice with the backtrack. The design and the models showcased at IAPPA seemed like a very solid offering, and I'm surprised that there were no buyers for it. The capacity is really the only concern to be had about it. Now, we know that parks seemingly could not care less about the capacity of their rides, but in 2012 it was a different time where capacity was still more of a concern. GCI advertised about 4 to 500 riders per hour and a speed of 32 miles an hour, which is honestly a perfect family coaster, and also has a relatively small footprint, which would be good for smaller parks. I would be rather curious to know why things never worked out for GCI with this model. The ride looks like a good time for everyone, featuring a ton of small twisted air time, which GCI has always been known for, just on a smaller scale. Rather funny how times change, because if this was released 10 years later, I feel like it would have been a massive hit. While I'm sure a lot of prototypes may have been lost to time, I tried to do my best to compile some of the more interesting ones that I could dig up. The fact that some of these were never built is rather interesting to me, and it really goes to tell that, like, the prototypes you're seeing, you never know which ones are going to be built, no matter how well fleshed out the idea is. It sure is fun to think about all of the hypotheticals when something new is announced, but the truth is that amusement parks may never bite on the things which enthusiasts spend their time dreaming about. It's been fun looking through these rides and wondering what could have been. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I have, and if you've made it to this point, I really appreciate all of you guys watching. I hope to see you all next week, but until then, take care, guys.